This year's deficit is expected to be $2.9 billion. Next year, we are projecting a surplus of $1.9 billion.
And with those words this week, Finance Minister Joe Oliver established the fiscal landscape for the next year and possibly for the next election. So what will it mean? Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce are all here at the table tonight. It's good to have you in the room. It's been a month since you were all in the same place. Those numbers, the fiscal update itself, obviously designed for the government. They want themselves to look good, but whose does it really play into? Whose hands does it play into most, considering everything's looked at in terms of an election a year away? Andrew.
Well, certainly off the blocks, it's the government's day. They get to frame the debate, as you said. They get to massage the numbers. I mean, the numbers are, broadly speaking, pretty good. We're heading into surplus from having had much larger deficits in the years past. They are doing their best to understate that, to make the numbers actually look worse than they are, because they want to limit as much room for opposition maneuver as they possibly can. And indeed, they've been trotting out some of their biggest election promises in advance of this day so that they hope to be able to occupy most of that fiscal room. That doesn't mean the opposition doesn't have any choices, but they have to actually choose. They can roll back some of these benefits that the Tories have promised. They can raise taxes. They can run into deficit. If you say that, you get Liberal partisans saying, how dare you suggest, or NDP partisans, how dare you suggest we would do such a thing, except you've got people on the left saying you should do precisely that. We should have a conversation about raising taxes. We should not have this bogeyman about running deficits. That's a perfectly valid conversation and debate to have in the next election.
Well, it may be a perfectly valid one to have, but every party that's tried to have that in an election usually doesn't do so well.
Although, if you look at the Ontario election, the Ontario Liberals ran on a new pension plan that was going to take money out of people's pockets to pay for. They didn't run on cutting taxes. They didn't run on eliminating the deficit. And they won a majority government. So yes, if you want to make a case that voters will find serious for what you would do with the money, you can probably do that. But that governments frame the debate to their advantage is not new. Paul Martin spent an entire campaign saying that eliminating the deficit, as the Reform Party was claiming that it would do, was a terrible thing, and then eliminated the deficit. And then in the next election said that the Reform Party talking about tax cuts was irresponsible because it would squander this earned victory, and then he cut taxes. So it's a game that governments now play, and the opposition has to frame its discourse around it.
Well, before we get Bruce's thoughts on this, let's watch how the opposition tried to frame it. Here are the two opposition leaders.
I think that the most important thing to remark is the most obvious one. We're now in an election year. So nothing that Mr. Oliver said today is actually going to have to be measured against the real world. He can put up a lot of figures, almost all of which are within the margin of maneuver of his $3 billion contingency fund.
I think this government has demonstrated that it is out of touch with Canadians. Why else would you propose something that helps, gives no help to 85% of Canadians and instead benefits the 15% of wealthiest families, including mine and Mr. Harper's?
All right, so there you hear everybody's framing. Where are you on this, Bruce?
Well, I think, first of all, it is a good day for the country that we're in the fiscal situation that we're in. It's a good day for the government that they've been the stewards that got us to that situation. But two things strike me. One is Joe Oliver as finance minister. I can't really speak to his competence as a finance minister, but as a communicator, the government has lost something. He's not very strong in the House. He doesn't tend to deliver this kind of news with any sense of aspiration or excitement. And so I think the government needs to think about that as they prepare for an election campaign and how they can maybe get more mileage out of the fiscal improvements that they brought. I think the second thing is that, well, the government is trying to lay out choices that preclude other parties from making choices that sound fiscally credible. I think they're making an assumption that may not be accurate, which is that they get to be the judges of the fiscal responsibility of what other parties propose. I'm not sure that Canadians will say that that's the way that it should be. I think the Conservatives have been wrong a lot of the time in terms of the estimates of the fiscal situation. They said that they were wrong even again yesterday in terms of the impact of oil prices and so on. So I think other parties will get to propose what they want, and they won't necessarily be held accountable to the government's sense of what's affordable and what's not.
And you can go back actually quite a long ways looking at estimates that come out of fiscal updates and budgets. And quite often those numbers are wrong.
Yeah, and to repeat that point, that the other parties can step outside the box the Conservatives have put for them if they're willing to challenge some of these conservative orthodoxies. I happen to share some of those orthodoxies, but it's a worthwhile debate to have. What they can't do is repeal the laws of arithmetic. What they can't do, for example, is, first of all, if they're going to have a surplus at all, it's because of the Tory spending cuts that have been, in some cases, quite unpopular and certainly have been denounced by the opposition. So if they don't promise to, if they promise to repeal those cuts, there's no more surplus. So they've got to be conscious of that. Secondly, if they're going to talk about raising taxes, so far the only tax increase we've heard of is the NDP say they would raise corporate taxes by some amount. That doesn't actually raise you very much money. So if you're counting on that to fund your spending programs, you're going to have to make the numbers stretch, and your credibility is going to come under scrutiny.
When the voters decide that they want change, they will buy a lot of stuff that people will say make no sense. They will buy a GST cut that all economists say this is not what you should be doing with the money. It's going to have consequences that aren't worth that cut. They will also buy a promise to eliminate the GST, as if taxes could suddenly disappear and the federal government in deficit at that point would still be okay. So there is more than enough room for the opposition parties to come up with a different vision. I think it's probably wise on the part of the Liberals to focus on income splitting as an unfair tax cut, because I think you can make that case to a lot of voters. But I agree with Andrew to just say we're going to increase taxes on corporate Canada and the money will be there is probably not going to cut it. To try to tell Canadians you can have your conservative cake and eat it too with our Liberal programs or our NDP programs, that's not going to work because people will say these people are not responsible.
You know, just on Andrew's earlier point, I've been thinking about it. Again, 79, Joe Clark beat Pierre Trudeau with a promise to have a deficit, a stimulative deficit, he called it, and Trudeau made a lot of fun of him, lost the election, for the reasons you're pointing out, that they wanted a change in government. Yes. It almost didn't matter. Bruce, react to this. Topic 2, President Obama announces a deal with China on emissions. Took everybody by surprise. Here's how he said it.
This is a major milestone in the U.S.-China relationship, and it shows what's possible when we work together on an urgent global challenge. In addition, by making this announcement today together, we hope to encourage all major economies to be ambitious, all countries, developing and developed, to work across some of the old divides so we can conclude a strong global climate agreement next year.
Major milestone. Does this really change the equation out there in terms of the debate surrounding a climate agreement?
I think it does. I think it's potentially a very important breakthrough, Peter. And not just because the substantive effect that more efforts by those two economies can have on global emissions, but because of the follow-on effect on other democracies where these debates have become mired to some degree in the question of how much should we do if China's not going to do anything. That has been a sticking point in the debate here in Canada for some people, not for everybody, but it's a complicating factor that gets removed if, in fact, this deal turns into something meaningful, substantive, and is put in place.
Andrew.
There's both more to it and less to it than meets the eye. Mostly what they've committed to is what they're mostly on track to be doing anyway, to a great extent. But I agree with Bruce.
The Americans?
Both the Americans and the Chinese. The Chinese have said we're going to peak at 2030. That's where most of the projections were they were going to be anyway for their emissions. The Americans have, in theory, have bumped up their commitment from 17% below 2005 levels to 28% below. But the measures that Obama had already announced are, again, experts would say, are mostly put them on track to that. But what's most important is they've locked themselves in. They've committed themselves publicly. There's the symbolic thing and the impact in other countries, including, of course, the impact here. We're already nowhere near meeting our Copenhagen targets of 17% below 2005 levels. We don't have a plan to get us there. None of the parties are really talking seriously about the kinds of measures that will get us there. Mostly all of them are calculating that Canadians talk a good game. We want something done, but we want somebody else to pay for it. But mostly and Bruce can either back me up or correct me on this, but my sense of public opinion is we don't want to be offside with other countries. We don't want to be the outlier. And so that was, I think, why Harper said, well, I'm just going to do whatever the Americans do. So if that's the case, and if it becomes apparent that we really are diverging from where the Americans are, there may be more of a public impetus to say, hey, we're offside here. We need to pull up our socks.
Chantal?
It is the first thing that really restores momentum to the climate change international debate since the global economic crisis. So on that basis, yes, something happened. What is fascinating about it is one of the reasons that the Chinese are coming to the table is because their own public opinion, even in a place that is not terribly democratic, is pushing for it, because the reality of the pollution and the environment there has become a daily concern of people. So it's a peek into the future. It would have been more of a landmark if it had happened earlier in the tenure of President Obama, though. It's not clear what is coming in the US, and I suspect that while this takes away the favorite excuse of our government for saying we're waiting for the US to walk in step with us, doesn't remove it entirely, in the sense that there will be people inside the conservative tent and under that tent who will say, well, wait, you know, the Republicans are coming, they have a different outlook, and this is just show for the end of the Obama period.
Which may be the same situation with Keystone. The Republican Senate now pushing that, the pipeline again, but the White House basically saying today that the president would veto it if it came to him. So we'll have to see how that one unfolds. Last topic. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey and his, you know, sit down and shut up line to a heckler. We had a heckling incident here in Canada this week that had an interesting end to it. So we'll show it to you first. Justin Trudeau at a book signing, and there were some pipeline people there who wanted to make their point. This is how he handled that situation. Watch this.
Okay, please, take 2 seconds, take a minute to explain to people your position, and then we'll get back to this.
Energy is for the equivalent of 7 million cars on the road. Canada will fail every climate target if it goes through. As a young person, I want you, Mr. Trudeau, to call for a full climate review of Energy East, because climate is part of the environment and it's damn well part of my future. So
thank you very much.
Please, and please act meaningfully on the climate.
Thank you. And we'll give a round of applause for
All right, so a little cell phone video there. That's why it's shaky and kind of out of focus and everything else. But you get the idea. Trudeau basically gave him the floor for a minute or so. Work? Not work. Very different than the sit down and shut up line from Christie. But how does that play?
Well, I happen to think it's effective. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I want to disclose again that my clients include pipeline companies. I personally like the idea of this pipeline, and my daughter does communications work for Justin Trudeau. What I see in what he did was that he took a moment that can sometimes turn into an ugly moment in a public setting. If you try to hustle protesters out, if you can prolong and enlarge the issue. Instead, I think by showing that he was willing to turn the floor over to them for a limited period of time and say, and then let's get back to what we were doing before, he put himself at some risk, but in a way that probably conveyed an attitude and an openness to being challenged that viewers and voters might find quite welcome, and a contrast to some degree with the extreme control that the government has been placing around appearances of the Prime Minister and important events by the government, including yesterday's fiscal update, where there were no questions allowed at the end.
One assumes other hecklers, though, may take this as okay, we know where to go if we want to get a platform. We've only got a minute left. Sorry.
You know, it doesn't seem a day goes by we don't have Justin Trudeau in the news for something. And then these repeated exposures, I think we learned sort of 2 types of things about him. When he weighs in on deeper questions of policy, he oftentimes seems out of his depth. It doesn't seem like he's really thought it through. On questions of how to be a politician, how to conduct yourself in the public sphere, he does seem to have quite good instincts. And I think both of those come from this self-assurance he has as the Dauphin, having grown up in the public eye. It can lead him astray sometimes, but it can also give him that kind of self-assurance where a lesser politician, somebody who is less secure in his own skin, would try to shout down or stare down the heckler. He's secure enough to say, hey, take the floor for a minute.
You got the last word.
There's a lot less security around an opposition leader than the Prime Minister, and that security does interfere with demonstrators when the Prime Minister is on stage. This was not a partisan event, it was a book event, so the kind of crowd in there is less angry if someone interrupts, more likely to entertain this. That being said, for sure, Justin Trudeau has more people's skills on that level, as Andrew was saying, than many other politicians. It's not Stephen Harper's forte to reach out to a crowd and to do the Main Streeting, and it showed in that episode. But if I were the other parties, having seen this, I wouldn't send demonstrators to the Justin Trudeau rallies.
Okay. All right. Good context on that, too. Thank you all. Good conversation.